Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
One of the most controversial issues, I would say, in America right at the moment deals with the issue of the Patriot Act and in the proposed Patriot Act number 2. And part of this has to do with the discussion of facilities and materials in libraries, actually the materials of the content. And we're very pleased to have three very distinguished guests today to talk about this issue that is being discussed all over America. And first of all, I'd welcome to the program Joe Reiss, who is the director of the Post Falls, Idaho Public Library. And next to him is Denise Clark, North Idaho College librarian. And over on the other side of the table, we have John Hartung, who is the co-director of the Kootenai-Shoshone area libraries. Thanks to all three of you. I know it's a very important subject, and you're very kind to give us this time and your expertise. And with that, I'd like to introduce Erna Reinhardt, our panelist, and ask her to commence today's questioning.
Welcome to the show, all three of you. It's wonderful to have you here. The Patriot Act came out of the September 11th and all of the concern in the United States about terrorism. And it's interesting that libraries are one of the things that affect that. Tell us a little bit about how the Patriot Act affects our libraries, Denise.
I'd be happy to start this discussion, Erna. One of the most egregious sections of the USA Patriot Act is Section 215, which really grants really unprecedented authority to the FBI to issue warrants to search libraries, patron records, booksellers, sales records to bookstore users, purchasers of materials in bookstores, medical records even. So this is one of probably one section of the Act that has been extremely problematic to librarians, though there are others, but Section 215. So it allows the FBI to come in with a warrant, request records from the librarian with no discussion. This cannot, this visit is not to be shared with the press. Any records obtained on an individual's use you cannot share that visit, with a patron whose records have been requested. So it's quite an invasive act. I'm sure my colleagues would love to chime in with.
Well, I'm not sure if anybody really knows at this point what the scale of the problem. Well, the interesting part about this is that there was a recent speech by Attorney General John Ashcroft where he said, "What's all the fuss about? There's been no searches in libraries." Well, the interesting thing about that is that even if there has been, we couldn't say because the librarians couldn't report by the law, and if there has been any request under Section 215. So right now, the American Library Association is acting to try and put in a Freedom of Information request to find out if there actually has been any imposition of 215 on any libraries. But until then, I don't think anybody can really say. What Denise is saying is if an FBI agent came into my library and asked to see certain records, it would be either shut up and do what they tell me to do and not tell anybody, including a lawyer for the city or newspaper reporter or you. And if I wasn't willing to do that, then I would suffer the consequences. Consequences right now, I believe, are going to jail.
That's true. The other thing that's important about Section 215 is that it does not require an agent to demonstrate probable cause, which has always been the American legal jurisprudence sort of baseline for issuing warrants. The Foreign Intelligence Security Act courts can basically issue these warrants on an agent's belief that the records may be related. Notice that there's no shall or proof or anything. This is simply an agent who feels or believes that there's some related issue for terrorist activities, and the court actually, the FISA courts have actually protested some of this because it flies in the face even of their own procedures, which are significantly less strict than a standard court proceeding. So it does have, in that sense, whether the law has been used or not, it does have sort of a chilling effect when that kind of information is out. And I know for a fact in this county there are patrons of my library that have turned in their library cards. They will not use the library because they are afraid their records will be searched.
And my understanding also is that we're not just talking about books and literature and magazines, that it goes beyond that, and that one of the things that many people go to the library for today is to use the computer terminals that you have to either do some web surfing or to do some emailing. So let's talk about that, and how does the Patriot Act cover the use of computers and internet and those kinds of things?
Well,
It covers
it covers it. Wiretapping for phones have been expanded. Also, any review of how people have used computers, they can come in and leave with computer hard drives to trace how and wow email, for example, or what searches a particular person, patron has, executed. So it's very invasive, as it includes not only those records. It was interesting that Joe said that, well, we don't exactly know. According to an article in one of the latest issues of the Library Journal, published by the American Library Association, supposedly there's been a claim that there have been about 200 visits to libraries from FBI agents to libraries in this country. Of course, what we don't know is whether those visits were directly related to the USA Patriot Act, though Ashcroft says not. We don't know that, but there have been since 9/11 200 visits. And we're seeing more visits to libraries in this country by FBI agents.
And I know Denise just first actually meant to probably say that Library Journal is by Connors. It's not the American Library Association doesn't actually publish that. Library Journal is another one of our magazines of the field, but that one's by the Connors publishing people, private. Let's get a little bit of history here. This isn't just starting with today. I mean, what going back a little bit into the Cold War days, the FBI had something called the Library Awareness Program. And that's when they decided that they would be looking for communist influences or the acts of communist agents who were using American libraries to find non-classified materials for obviously Cold War purposes. And so way back when, there was a program where FBI agents would come in and look through the records, library records, and see what people were checking out and what was going on. And eventually the American political body, all of us, decided that wasn't such a great idea. It could have been something to do with the Cold War cooling off, but I think it's also had to do with the idea that people got a little leery of people staring over their shoulder, and basically that's what it is. So the history is that this didn't start with the Patriot Act. This was a battle that I think, and I hate to put it in terms of battle, but it really was a legal battle that was fought, and I think as librarians we thought had been decided prior to 9/11 with the pretty much the ending of the Library Awareness Program, because it got called off.
It ended, right.
For the serious concerns. And basically, I think right now, in some ways we feel that it's back with a vengeance.
I think there's one thing that is important. Most states have on their books encoded the privacy of library records as relating to the circulation of items, and that includes what someone would look at on a terminal for email or for a website. And the Patriot Act supersedes all of those. And so the fact that Idaho has a very explicit statement about what librarians are required to do to protect the privacy of patrons' records is completely overthrown by the Patriot Act, and that's another area that sort of seems overboard in imposing a national one-size-fits-all standard on individual librarians and libraries.
My question is quite involved, but it requires for our viewers to understand a little bit of background. We have this real challenge in democracy. As, the late Senator Frank Church once said to me that the power of the Soviet Union and communists was a threat and a danger, and that we had to address that. But he also indicated that as we address that, if we give up our civil liberties while trying to deal with the threats, they win. We lose because we lose our democracy. Congressman Butch Otter of our district, I think, is saying something very similar today. Congressman Otter has certainly been the #1 person in the Congress that's been leading this charge of dealing with this very great debates going on about the Patriot Act. We too all recognize that terrorists are dangerous, and we saw the tragedy in New York and Washington, D.C. and in Pennsylvania, and the terrorists are really out to destroy democracy. And so, but I think, and I can't speak for him, but I think Congressman Otter is saying something similar to Senator Church said, and that is let's address the threat, but let's do it in such a way that we don't lose our liberties. That's what they're after, to cause us to react in such a way that we lose our liberties. So I guess my very involved question is, in World War I, the United States Supreme Court said in Schenck versus the United States that there are things that have no consequence in time of peace, like free speech, that are not protected in time of all-out war or great threat. Very involved question. And libraries and books and ideas and speech and press is crucial to the democracy. And so I will start over here with John this time, and that is, what recommendation you have is, and we're addressing libraries particularly here, but how do we make this very important balance, and what's the role of how libraries can deal with that?
I think that the role libraries play can be crucial, and one of the board members on my library board has said that in many ways libraries are the fundamental cornerstone of democracy because of the ability to provide equal access to information. When you have a situation like 9/11 and the responses afterward, I think people who are afraid for their lives are committed to security at all costs, and I think that becomes an overriding concern to the point that some folks may be willing to trade their civil liberties for a sense of security. At this point, I think that it becomes important that all of the available information that is not of national security importance be available to everyone so people can become aware. I think an example of the kind of information libraries can do is the program that Joe ran at the Post Falls Library this last fall on the world of Islam, and had some very good speakers come in and address that, so that people who knew nothing about Islamic culture and ways of life could become informed. And I guess that's a balance point to the issue of shut down the information because we don't want to let someone know anything.
Joe, we'll let you react to the same kind of question of, again, a preface by saying what is the role of libraries in protecting free speech and free press, and how do you protect the democracy in the country and at the same time not lose any of those First Amendment rights?
Well, if I had the answer to that, I would probably be elected to something.
You'd probably be in Washington, D.C.
Yeah. You know, Tony, I think what really scares me is and I think it's kind of a history that we have in this country, is that in times like this, sometimes we let our fears get the better of us, and it becomes a stepping stone, though. You know, the Patriot Act might have its good points, might have its bad points, but what I'm really worried about is where do we go next from the Patriot Act? There's already the son of Patriot is waiting in the wings to tighten those screws even more. And then we have Senator Hatch. I'm not trying to throw any political or personal names into this, but basically Senator Hatch would like to tie that into narco-terrorism. So all of a sudden now we're not dealing just with political terrorism, we're dealing with people who are also in the narcotics business because they're also sometimes tied to terror. And it's another stepping stone farther and farther along. So what really worries me is where it all heads, and at what point do we finally say that's enough and start looking about getting back to where we were. That's my personal fears.
Denise?
Well, democracy is a risky business in many ways. And I think we have to, libraries are called the people's universities, the people's colleges. This is where many come for information, for knowledge, just to learn. Censorship occurs in libraries when you have acts like Section 215 of the Patriot Act, and all of a sudden librarians become fearful. It's not only the patrons become fearful, but librarians become fearful of what they're purchasing, what they're making available. Booksellers also start to look at what they're selling. And so it creates a snowball effect. We've talked about some of them, but the snowball effect can be even more self-censorship. People start self-censoring. They stop being candid, using their email, or they stop to think about what they're using, of what they're seeking out on the internet. They wonder about checking out this material. Should I do this if my record is going to become available? And all of a sudden, we find ourselves in a situation where we have, shut down our ability. Sometimes we do it to ourselves, to ask those, questions that we must ask to keep.
In non-democratic countries, everybody at this table is a great supporter of democracy, and we detest totalitarian systems and dictatorships, and we also speak loudly against the terrorists because they certainly are not supporters of democracy. But at the same time, if you look at our history in the world of where there are dictatorships, that's part of the way to control. I visited the Soviet Union when it was still under the control of the Communists with a group of students, and I was glad to come home. It was a terrible system, and there was control of everything. There was only the party newspaper and the government newspaper. But my point is that what I saw there is that part of the control was just out of fear. And by fear, people tend not to want to do things that is part of the free process. So anyway, but here's my other question before I go back to Erna, and that is, and I'll start with you, Denise, this time, and that is, have we become too record-oriented? Have we found libraries being an example? Have we, over time, even before this act, do we keep too many records?
Well, I would say probably some of us have, but one great thing about the Patriot Act and 250, it made us look at some of our procedures and some of our processes and look at what we are keeping and ask ourselves the questions, why are we keeping this information? Is it absolutely vital to the functioning of the library? Is it vital to, and a lot of libraries have said, that the staff have dealt with this issue. No, we're not going to keep these paper trails. No, we're not going to keep circulation records forever, on a patron. So in that respect, I think it's made us sit up and look at some of our practices.
Joe? Well, Tony, I'm not sure if it's the amount of records so much as the access to them. Because these days, it used to be one thing to have a record on a piece of paper. We all know how ubiquitous the internet has gotten to be. And right now, most of our record keeping, just like everybody else's, is getting to be electronic. And we can't have the same safeguards we used to think. Locking something in a safe before, a piece of paper in a safe, unless they broke in and opened up that safe, it was pretty secure. But right now, we're not living in that kind of world. We're living in a world that we're not sure of ourselves. I think there's a great unease just for the way we have access to our records these days.
We hear a lot, John, about some of these novels, and at Symposio you heard about it, Orwell's 1984 and Big Brother. Is that where we're headed?
Oh, I certainly hope not. I would want to check out if that's where we're going. But I think that the wake-up call is there, and I'm hoping that Representative Otter and some of the other congressional leaders are beginning to open their eyes. The fact that the Patriot Act was passed in a record short period of time with very little consideration, there really wasn't due process. And democracy is slow and sloppy, and there are a lot of processes that take time to work well. And I think that's where we need to get back to the balance of taking the time to examine legislation carefully and to see what the unintended consequences is, where I think a lot of our fears are, that the Patriot Act is just one stone in the pond and the waves are still rippling out.
I want to go back to your question because you stole my question.
That was not intentional. We just think alike, I guess.
Educate our viewers about what actually specifically happens when they go into the library to check out some materials, or when they're on the computer and they visit some websites. I'm curious, does the American Library Association, do they have suggestions and guidelines for all the libraries across the United States to follow? Or if you come into the library at a college or university in the state of Idaho, what are the guidelines there, and what are the guidelines at the community libraries? Denise?
Yes, they have posted some guidelines that libraries could use. We actually do have a notice on each computer station that says, and I'll read this to you. My memory is bad, but it just says, under Provision 215 of the USA Patriot Act, your computer transactions can be demanded from library staff by federal agents without your knowledge or consent. That lays it right out, there, so that they know that. One of the things that we tell patrons, and we have this information available, is that we do not keep circulation records. Current circulation transaction is all that is available. We do not keep any past transaction records. We're very careful in our interlibrary loan paperwork. We go through that. We get rid of what we don't need. We get rid of patrons' names on that. So we put people at ease by letting them know that we are taking steps to safeguard, their privacy. And we also have a privacy policy that's in place. We also have a procedure in place if we are visited by an FBI agent with a warrant. We have those in place. So we've done some homework.
Joe, is that true also at the community libraries?
I think it's pretty much true of all modern day libraries. Electronic records are erased as soon as, but of course there is that period while you have it. While you have it, there is an electronic record, of course. When you bring it back, it's gone. Internet access is a different story. I mean, there's so many ways of libraries accessing the internet that I wouldn't try and venture out and say, what happens with everybody. But, we do have servers. We do have internet service providers. There's a lot of links in the chain. So can we guarantee anything? No. Do we try and protect people's privacy as much as possible? Yes.
We do use software on the individual workstations to try and erase transaction records with folks who are using email and internet access. Is that 100%? No. If some real hotshot hacker got a hold of one of the hard drives, I'm sure they probably could resurrect those records. The question I think that we have been forced to face is, how can we uphold to the best of our ability the Idaho and other states' privacy statutes and maintain our operations at some reasonable level, at the same time recognizing that all of the records that we're maintaining are subject to seizure, if you will. And we do the best we can to protect the patron's privacy, but as Joe said, there's no 100% guarantee, and I'm sure that anyone who uses a library these days, particularly an electronic resource, that record is trapped or could be trapped at some point.
James Madison gave us the checks and balances, and it's been a great part of our democracy with the three branches of government. Obviously, all of this has to wind up in court, and someone's going to be challenged somewhere at some point. What do you see coming down the pike as far as this could be litigation in the courts. Denise?
I don't see anything in the courts. I see a lot of legislation that has been introduced, though, to amend the Patriot Act.
But it can be tested in court also.
I suppose, yes. But I've not seen that or read anything about any kind of a court case. I see most of the efforts going into amending the Patriot Act or sunsetting some of the provisions of the Patriot Act, such as 215. Or when I was looking at the number of
now, there is already a sunset provision in the law.
There is a sunset provision in the law, yes, which well, that's another another issue too. But when I look through the pending legislation concerning the USA Patriot Act that deals with some of these sections like 215 and others, there is at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There must be at least 12 that have been introduced either in the House or that have come from the Senate.
In the U.S. Congress. Mm-hmm. Joe, how do you react to that question?
I don't think it's going to be settled anytime in the near future in the courts. I think that it's more of a political battle than it is judicial.
And that the Congress may act on it before it would get to the at least high court.
Well, it could go the other way. I think what my fears, as I said earlier, is that not that we're going to see the Patriot Act retracted, but rather we're going to see it expanded greatly, perhaps.
How do you see it, John?
I share Joe's concern. I think as long as no library is deliberately targeted and a major library director or staff member stood up and said, "Take me to jail," and then fought it that way, I think the issue is that the balance has shifted in our system so that the executive branch of the government is wielding an ever larger sword, and it's up to the legislature to kind of put some controls on that.
Well, since there's people like Congressman Otter and our senators from Idaho and our other congressmen, there's a real movement to address it. So I might be more optimistic than Joe would be that they may not only not pass another, but may make some amendments to this one. Certainly there's a lot of momentum from the right and the left in the political world. It's fascinating to watch the conservatives and liberals and all get together. There's a real movement that happens in democracy from time to time. With that, we have to bring our permanent conclusion. On behalf of our panelists and our staff, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, hope you'll be with us again next week at the same time. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.